I'm really excited to share today's video with you because this is my very first project with a CNC machine. I'm so excited to be partnering with Inventables and sharing how to make these awesome modern cake plates with the X-Carve. I'm sharing the easel cut files for both of these cake plates. I'll have a link to them in the description below as well as on my website. And when you open it up, you'll notice possibly on the upper right-hand corner, there may be a spot where it says you can't save this unless you make a copy. That's because you're using a public file. Mine doesn't show that because I made it. And then down here on the bottom left, you'll see there are 3 different work pieces for the project. The first 2 work pieces will be cut out of the same wood. I actually found that with the carved sections and then the cutting all the way through around the outer of the circle, it was cutting a little funny by not separating them, and separating them made it a lot easier and cleaner and actually minimized the carving time by about 30 minutes. So that is why those are separate. And then the third work piece is the one we're going to start with. That is the work piece for the top. And that is going to be cut out of acrylic. So make sure on your materials that you select acrylic, double check the thickness of your acrylic, and then we can move on to the X-Carve. One of the things I learned is when you're putting the material on the X-Carve, with my type A personality, always wanted to line it up perfectly with the grid, but you actually need to pay attention to where the material sits in reference to the holes that your clamps go into. If you line it up perfectly with the grid on a bold line or something, you may end up with spots that will not be able to be clamped down. So line it up that way, and then when you go to clamp it down, the other thing that I've learned is don't put a clamp at the lower left-hand corner, which is actually where you will set your XY0, because the bit, before it starts carving, actually drops to just above the material right at the corner of that axis, and then it'll shoot out to its first cut. And I have put holes in quite a few of my clamps doing that. And with these little clamps, you use the steppers to make sure that the back side of the clamp is a little high and then the front side is actually low, and that gives you a really good grip on your material, and I haven't had any problems with things moving. I also use the Z probe to set my Z axis before cutting. Have had really good success with it. It's super easy. You can do it manually, but I always use the Z probe. Also for the acrylic, I did use an 1/8 inch single flute spiral upcut. And what that does is it actually pulls all of the bits out of the workpiece as it's cutting, because it's an upcut on the spiral. So it's pulling those cut pieces of acrylic out, and I haven't had any problems with any burning. And I also used the standard feed and speeds that X-Carve has in their easel software, and the material, the 1/4 inch acrylic standard feed and speeds has worked great for me. All of these designs have tabs to help keep it so that the piece, when it is fully cut through, does not break off and get damaged as the router is continuing to go. So definitely just be aware of that. Use a chisel or a knife, X-Acto knife, something like that, to just pop those tabs. Now it's time to cut the base, and like I said, I used Purple Heart for this, and this is a 3/4 inch piece. It's 6 inches by 12 inches, and I got this on the Inventable site. For this, because we are doing 2 separate pieces, it is really important that you really center that XY axis and have a definitive point for that. What I like to do is really take the time for these to either put a teeny dot with a pencil in the corner where you're going to set your XY0, or really center it on the very corner of your wood, so that if you do have an issue, you can realign that XY and have it cut the second work piece on top of it and be really nice. After cutting out the first workpiece, I decided to kind of show you on my screen setting up for the second workpiece. And I'm really glad I did, because this is where I came up with my first issue. So I got everything confirmed. My bit for this one, I'm using an 1/8 inch straight cut for all of the wood. Set everything up proper with my probe. And then I went to confirm turn everything on, and I used the previous XY axis for this because the computer and the machine had not been turned off. And then I get this error, and this error says it's not going to cut. So I thought, okay, that's really odd. I've never seen this error before in any of my tests. So I just decided to run it again. And after about 5 times of getting the same exact error, I decided to turn things off and then turn them back on again, and I still was receiving this error. Well, I discovered the problem for this error is that my material thickness was set to 0.75 inches, but my cut depth was set to 0.76 inches. So that teeny tiny bit of extra cut depth was causing me to have the error saying it was going to cut into my wasteboard. Here it is cutting through on that board, and you can see there is a slight shadow on one side of the circles where it was carved through, and so I do have to just chisel or sand that off. It was probably about a 32nd of an inch, so it wasn't a big deal. I was off just a little bit, and you can't really tell on anything else except for that little bit of a lip, which was able to be removed. But then I came across error number 2 on this carve, and what happened is my bit broke. I was probably about 90% done with carving through the larger stepped circle when the bit broke. And instead of trying to reline it back up and hope that it worked again, I decided to just use the jigsaw and my router to get that extra 10% done. So here you can see I'm just using a knife and the chisel to help get those out. The knife worked really good for that teeny tiny 0.01% that hadn't carved through on the bottom, because my depth was set slightly incorrect when it should have been 0.76 and it was actually 0.75. So I returned my Purple Heart piece back to the X-Carve, and I actually rotated it and moved around the pieces for the final that needed to be cut, and I cut those out. And then I removed them from my Purple Heart, and it was time to also remove the piece that had only cut about 90% through. So what I ended up doing was using my jigsaw to cut around it, and that allowed me to get get the piece out of the wood. And then I took it over to my router, and with a flush trim bit, I just flush trimmed around it so that the bottom little bit that wasn't final cut through with the X-Carve was nice and clean. So I used my knife and my chisel to make sure all of the little tab pieces were off. I used my knife kind of as a whittle to carve off any tabs or bits that hadn't cut through as cleanly, and it worked really, really well. And then I grabbed just my little battery-powered corner cat sander and used it to sand off all the edges that I could before the glue up. So I wanted the wood base to come up through a center hole in the acrylic, but because the dowel is not the matching Purple Heart, I didn't want the dowel to be visible. I wanted it to be Purple Heart. So I used the X-Carve, super easy, added a couple plugs. Now the first couple plugs I cut out ended up being a little too loose in my acrylic, so I ended up making them a little bit bigger. I think the second 2 that I ended up cutting were 0.515 inches and 0.520 inches, and the 0.520 inch one is the one that ended up working nicely with the hole in the center of my acrylic. So I cleaned that one up, and then I used it as a plug in the acrylic when I dry fit everything on. That way the measurement for my dowel was the correct measurement with the plug in place. Now I did choose to remove the backing on my acrylic before gluing things all together, because I didn't want that tiny bit of thickness of the backing to affect how the depth of the plug. So I did remove that, and then I glued the plug into the base piece with it inside of the acrylic, just being really careful, trying not to get too much glue on the acrylic. It was able to be removed as needed, but I just tried to keep it as clean as possible. Then I was able to dry fit all of the other pieces on the dowel and cut it to length. And with the dowel cut to length, it was time for the final glue up. Now, one thing to note is you do want to be aware of how the grain patterns are lining up when you glue this together. Because you're dealing with circles, you have an end grain edge of the circle and an edge grain end of the circle. And the end grain edge will actually be a little bit darker in color once you apply any sealer or stain to it, because it just absorbs more, and this edge grain will not. Also, with gluing up, make sure that you're only putting glue on the smaller of the two pieces that are connecting. I put glue also on the dowel, but if you're gluing a smaller piece to a bigger piece and you accidentally put glue on the bigger piece, there's going to be a lot of glue for you to clean up after that's all done. And once all of the pieces were all glued together, I pulled it away from the acrylic because the acrylic is not actually attached at this point, and clamped it together to let the glue dry. After the glue dried, I took it off the clamps and gave it a little hand sanding. I also used my knife to kind of cut away any of the glue squeeze out. And to seal it, I wanted to definitely use a food safe sealer. I tack clothed it off to get it nice and clean, and then I ended up using Maker Brand Co. Simple Finish on these. Now, the larger cake plate, obviously the only area that could be in contact with food is just the plug, but I still wanted to keep it nice and food safe. And so I love this sealer because it also is really quick and easy one step. You could also use a cutting board sealer or conditioner. That would be really great for this, where it could be in contact with food. But again, like I said, I really do like this finish, and it really brought out the color of this purple heartwood. I think it just made it absolutely fantastic looking. And I really love how the cake plates turned out. This is, like I said, this is a great beginner project for a CNC machine because it uses a small bit of wood. It gives you a little bit of a foray into the 3D carving because of the steps on a couple of the pieces. Plus, it just cuts out circles with the other ones and makes a really, really fun end product that would be great for gifts, for Mother's Day, hostess gifts, and things like that. And you can have a lot of fun with the different types of wood that you could make these plates out of. I definitely, if you're going to use the wood top like I did for the smaller maple one, make sure you're using a wood that will be good with food. So anything that you would use for a cutting board, I wouldn't use something with an open grain. And really just have fun with it. And I'm so grateful to Inventables for partnering with me on this project, and can't wait to share many more projects using the X-Carve.